Good evening, everybody. I pushed on. Good evening, everybody. If you're wondering why I'm using a mic, I'm just letting everybody know that we have the meeting is actually being streamed so that the community can see what we're up to here. So, so, so we'll make sure that obviously that everything's communicated in an appropriate way for you guys to be able to ask questions. We want to make sure that your questions are heard, things like that. Making sure that the community is aware of what's discussed, and it gives them an opportunity if they're not able to make it down here to be able to see. And that way, when you're talking with any of your constituents, so you can take this back to them. It's placed on the website, but obviously following tonight as well, if you want to let other people know, you can share that information with them as well. All right. I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. We do have our first. It's always a part of any open meeting that we have to ask. Is there any public comment to begin? No. All right. So then we will move on to our action items. I do want to make a note that when we have for our action item, the letter C on our agenda, that is related to the minutes of our previous meeting on October 24th. And those minutes will always be shared with you, as we talked about last meeting. When we share those out, you guys have a chance to review. And then for the next meeting, we will always ask to approve those minutes before we move on. Okay? That way, if there's any types of comments that we need to share prior to getting started. So what I will ask is for a motion from the committee to approve the minutes from the October 24th meeting. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of approving them, or any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes from October 24th, say aye. Any opposed? All right. Approved. Now we will move to information and discussion, and we're going to start with our welcome and introductions. And this gives us a chance. I know at the last meeting, it was shared in here that it was an opportunity for us to connect a name and a face, and really what your affiliation is with the Dysart district. And so what we're going to do is take an opportunity right now. Mary Dell and I are going to walk around with the mic, and we're going to let you go ahead and introduce yourselves. Tell us your name. And if you could tell us how you're affiliated with Dysart, you could either tell us community member, a parent, the school that you're with. We just want to hear that. Obviously, there's a lot of people, so we didn't set it up to give a bio on everybody. I know we'll get to know each other as we go, but I think that'll at least help to get things rolling a little bit more as we move forward. So we're going to start over here, and then I'll do this table, and then Mary Dale will take a table, and we'll keep going.
You started with me last week, or a couple weeks ago. That's okay. I don't mind going first. My name's Travis Waddell. I'm a community member. I am a parent of a kindergartner, goes to Marley Park Elementary. I used to work in the district for a couple years. What else do you guys need to know or want to know?
Whatever you wanted to share, I think you set the great model for us. He said that was a perfect model of how to share it. If there's something else you say, I wanted to say this, and add something else little in there, that's perfect too. So we're going to keep going here.
Good evening. I'm Chantel McNeese. I am the principal for Countryside Elementary School just across the way. And I have been a Dysart employee for 17 years. So a long time, great district to be in.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Bill Pupo, and I'm a retired and past city manager here in Surprise. I chaired the override. I think it was 2015 or 2020. I'm a parent of a teacher and a grandparent of 2 students in Dysart District.
Good evening. My name is Tony Munoz. I am a parent from Dysart. I have 2 kids who have graduated from the district, and I have one who's currently enrolled at Ashton Ranch.
Tommy Eubanks. I've lived in Surprise since 2005, and I have 4 kids in the district, ages 16 to 6.
We'll move on to this table. Hello, I'm Felicia Williams. I have a son at Dysart High School, and we've been in the district for 2 years.
Good evening. My name is Jason Roberts. I have a daughter at Western Peaks Elementary, and we've lived in Surprise since March of 2021.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Setner, and I have a daughter at Sunset Hills in first grade.
Hello, I'm Tisha Jackson. I also am Air Force or retired Air Force spouse, so I work with Air Force families that are in the district, and I have 2 at Shadow Ridge and 1 at Cimarron Springs.
Tony Aldaco. I'm a native of Surprise. My husband and I both graduated from Dysart High School when it was the only high school. Taught in the district for a few years, and 2 boys graduated from Valley, and my daughter is currently at Sonoran Heights.
Hi, I'm Cameron Ferguson. I haven't worked for the district, but I've got 2 kids that are in Dysart Elementary Schools down at Riverview, so I'm a parent.
My name is Karen Cody. I am a community member. I do have 2 kids that graduated from Willow Canyon in 16 and 17 and went on to college. I also started the PTA at Willow Canyon High School for the high school. And I still volunteer at certain elementary schools when parents can't step up. I'll try to step up for them. And I live in the northwest of Surprise, where they're doing so much work there that we need a school there.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. I'm Wendy James. I'm a parent and a grandparent and a teacher, and I worked for the Dysart District for 14 years, Open Canyon Ridge. I was a librarian there, and then librarian at Willow Canyon also for 9 years. And now I'm a retired person, and I sub. So
I'm Kelly Spear. I'm a parent. I have 2 that have graduated from the district and 1 that's at Willow Canyon now.
Good evening. I'm Cassandra Johnson. I'm a parent. I have a 2nd grader at El Mirage Elementary. I have a 6th grader, sorry, I almost forgot, at the Dysart Middle School. And then I have a high schooler, and I also have a Primavera online student. I wanted to say happy belated Veterans Day to whomever is in here or your family that served, and happy belated birthday to the Marines. Hoorah. But I'm a Navy person. I'm a vet.
My name is Virginia Johnson. I'm a parent representing El Mirage Elementary School. I have 5 kids that attend there. I have a 3rd grader and 4 first graders.
I'm Janelle Aguilar. I have 2 grown graduated kids, and I have 1 in kindergarten at Thompson Ranch Elementary.
Then we'll move up to this front table.
Good evening. I'm Patrick Campbell, retired law enforcement and military, 32 years. I currently work security over at Shadow Ridge. I'm also a baseball coach, and I'm a parent, and just want to be here to help. So.
Hey team, my name is Johnny Melton, community member. I had both my stepkids graduate from Dysart, from Valley Vista next door. So it's a great district. I'm glad to be here, and thank you all for serving on this bond committee.
Hi, Rich Bose. Lived in the city for 23 years, had a daughter graduate in 2010, and just want to help the district out.
Hi everyone, Shannon Frazier. I am a teacher, parent, and community member. I teach over at the high school at Valley Vista. My children attend Mountain View, and I live in Surprise, and I've been here for about almost 10 years in the community.
I'm not standing, sorry. My name is Megan Perez. I'm a parent here. I have had 8 kids within the Dysart district, 4 from Willow Canyon who graduated, 2 are currently at Valley. 1's heading back to Kingswood with 2 special ed kids. So I used to be the former PTSA president of Kingswood, and I'm super excited to be here.
And we want to thank everybody for those warm introductions, and definitely, again, to reiterate what a few of the committee members said is thank you for being here. We really appreciate your giving up your time for this committee and serving our community. Thank you. At this time, we're going to move to letter D, item number 2. This is information on the fiscal year 23 district spending overview and discussion on potential bond and override. And at this time, I'll hand it back over to Marydell.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Musey. Hopefully, yep, we can hear me this time. We'll wait for that to get projected, the presentation. No? I think so. No? Okay. Got it. Okay. So last time that we met, we discussed the overview of what bonds and overrides were. And so I think as we went through it, we kind of talked about, okay, let's meet at this 30,000-foot level. Let's just kind of describe the differences between the two. How do they work? What items can be funded through either an override or a bond? And so what we wanted to do now is just start kind of drilling down a little bit further into what the M&O or what the financial status is of the district. And so you do have the presentation in front of you, so feel free to refer to that if necessary as well. So what we wanted to go through is the Maintenance and Operations Fund as it relates to Dysart. And so if you recall, we spoke about maintenance and operation are those things that can fund programs. That's what funds personnel. It funds utilities, really those consumables that are the non-capital, non-tangible, non-durable items. And so as it relates to Dysart, you'll see here for fiscal year 23, and so we are focusing on FY23 because that year was closed, and so it's really good to kind of just look at really a snapshot of actuals. And so our budget overall for the district was $188.8 million in M&O, and we spent $181 million expenditures, which left a total budget balance of about $7.7 million. What that equates to is about 4% of our budget is left in reserves. It's very similar to what, as a state, the state used to have a restriction on how much you can carry over as school districts. It's been lifted quite a few years back, probably about 7 years or so now. But we used to be capped at 4%. You couldn't spend or roll over more than 4% of your budget limit, thereby really saying if you're receiving these resources in that fiscal year, you should be utilizing in that fiscal year. There shouldn't be districts that are rolling over huge amounts of budget balances. You should be utilizing the funds that you have. And so as Dysart, we've continued that trend. That's been our focus is the funds we get. We want to ensure that we spend them accordingly. And obviously, we want to leave ourselves a little bit of an operating reserve cushion, which is about 4% this past year. So with maintenance and operations, you'll see the different program areas. With school districts, we have to break out what you spend in regular education, what we spend in special education, what we spend in transportation program, and then specifically we receive a little bit of funding from the state solely for our K-3 reading program to be able to pay for coaching, intervention, supplies, professional development, et cetera. And so you'll see the breakdown of the portion of maintenance and operations in those various program areas. And so ultimately just wanted to kind of give a recap on M&O. So it's $188.8 million. If you recall, the override for that past year was about $24 million in FY23, and we'll go over that a little bit later in the presentation. But that essentially $24 million of current approved override is in this $188.8 million budget. So hopefully that makes sense. I did want to state if anyone does have questions along the way, I know last time it was nice to have kind of the dialogue, so feel free, and then we'll make sure to come to you with a microphone. That way we can get your question as well. So next slide, please. So now we'll go into the capital funds. So as a district, we receive what's called district additional assistance. That's essentially that unrestricted capital fund. The budget that we had for FY23 was $18.5 million. So this is made up of what we receive from the state. If there's any carryover in there, that's added into the figure. And so ultimately, we had $18.5 million. We spent about $14 million. It is to note that most of what that $4.5 million that was rolled over was already committed to some other items. For example, we were waiting on some buses that didn't make it by the June 30th fiscal year, so we had to commit it. We had the purchase order, close it, open it up in the next fiscal year, so we already had that committed. So we run pretty tight on that as well in our capital. Debt service, that is the fund that's used to pay for our outstanding bonds. That pays for the principal and the interest for the bond payment. So you'll see that we fully budget for that amount. The taxes are assessed, which we talked about last time. The revenue comes in. It's sufficient to pay for that payment of that bond payment, and then that payment is made. So that one is essentially a wash. Then we get into what's called the Emergency Building Renewal Grant Program. This is a program that's funded by the state. It's run through the School Facilities Board, and it's an agency that's really put in place to, if school districts have noted that they have this additional need, we apply for grants. We submit applications and say, you know, this chiller is going down, this roof is needing additional assessment or additional repairs. It goes through a review process. Not necessarily all projects are approved. And it's also contingent on whether that agency has sufficient allocation. They receive their allocation from the state as well. And as school districts submit requests for these grants, obviously that allocation and that amount that they've been provided gets depleted. And so for fiscal year 23, we were approved for $14.7 million in projects. Those projects, you'll see only $7.875 million was spent because, again, some of those projects carried over into this year. And so we weren't able to make the payments until, obviously, the work is performed. And or it may have been that the project itself was approved, but we just didn't have the funding yet ultimately from the agency, and so we couldn't start those projects. But this really captures the bulk of what we as Dysart receive in capital funds for fiscal year 23. Something to note, though, that Building Renewal Grant Program, it is very fluid funds. It's depending on whether that agency even receives funds, how we submit our applications, if those applications are even approved for those various projects. And so really the ones that kind of highlight the best is really that first row, because the debt service is just really paying off previous debt. It's not, you know, purchasing any new additional things now. Any new capital items that really sustain the district's needs are in that first row. So hopefully that helps highlight that. Yes. Okay, just one moment, Craig. Oh,
we can do it. We can.
Oh, yes. No, go ahead. We'll repeat the question. Sorry, go ahead. Yes. There you are. Yes, please.
Sorry.
So the question is whether the K-3 reading program, and that's typically the funding that we receive. Yes, that does. It's funded based on the enrollment in that K-3 reading group, so that will fluctuate on how many students we receive or we have enrolled in that age group. But it does hover between $700,000 in M&O. We do receive about another $300,000 or so that we have actually allocated over into capital to support the K-3 program. And so what we purchase on there are some instructional aids. Instructional aids, according to the state, if they're kits, if they're things that tangibles that they can continue to use in the classroom year after year, the state requires us to put those in capital. So those are captured ultimately in the unrestricted capital. But as a district, we receive related to our K-3 reading program funded by the state about $1 million. You're very welcome. Yes.
The transportation, the 6.1%. Obviously represents the percentage of transportation within the L&M budget.
Yes.
Is there additional transportation costs outside of M&O?
So the question is, does the 6.1% spent in transportation account for the majority of the district's transportation expenses? The majority of our transportation is going to be captured in M&O. We pay for our bus drivers out of their bus aides, the fuel, the diesel, just repairs and maintenance on the buses. There may be a little bit kind of outside if there's, in capital, let's say we purchase a new engine or a transmission or just other parts that extend the useful life of that bus. That item will be captured in capital, but transportation related to consumables, salaries, supplies, et cetera, that the majority of it is captured in the maintenance and operations fund.
You have a follow-up question?
Sure.
To the best of your knowledge, is that number bigger than it was previous? Is it like 2022, for example, or 2020?
So the question is the amount in transportation higher than in previous years? I would say yes, because we also, if you recall, a couple years ago, we did have, as our governing board approved for, to address the shortage in bus drivers. We went up in the daily, in the hourly rate to them, which then increases the budget that we're apportioning for the transportation line item. You're welcome. Okay, so we'll go on into, so this is a good overview on seeing where we fell related to the overall spending across the state. So just to kind of recap the process, as a district, we get our annual financial report submitted, we compile all that, we submit that every year. It's due by October 15th to the Arizona Auditor General. Every school district has to supply this information, and so they then compile this and they prepare what's called an estimated or a district classroom spending report. Because we just submitted our FY23 in October, they haven't put the report out. It usually comes out about January, February, but our accounting team does an awesome job of estimating, and they're usually spot on with our initial calculations. But you'll see the FY22 numbers on here as well for comparison. So basically you'll see the dark, well, the blue area there, the 56.65% is what we spent in instruction. And again, as school districts, we have to follow what's called a chart of accounts. And so it's a uniform chart of accounts with the intention that if you're a school district in this part of Arizona or in this one, we're all uniformly coding all of our expenses the same. Reason why is that way we're then all comparing apples to apples. That District A doesn't code their personnel in this way and someone else codes them this way. So really when you look at districts and compare them to one another, you should be uniformly comparing their expenses together. So you'll see the, yes? Yes. So the question is there more information available to find out what's included in the various functions? Yes. So there's what's called the USFR chart of accounts. I'm happy to send a link to that. It is some very riveting reading. I carry the book near and dear with me usually, and I'm surprised I don't have it with me. But it really does provide examples of this is the type of items you would need. If you're in a student support, okay, well, what type of personnel should be included in that? And so they do provide examples, but yes, I'd be happy to, we can include the link to that if we wanted to afterwards to the committee, so you can review through that. You're welcome. Excuse me, so the different functions, as you'll see, a few years ago, the state started combining what they called classroom spending. So rather than just solely focusing on instruction function, they realized there's other functions that really do support the classroom. You might have additional instructional support positions that are there. You may have, just different personnel and different expenses that are in those top three functions, as you see, instruction, student support, and instruction support, that really further the classroom instructional dollar. So there's a separation between those three functions and then the next four functions that are really more operational. Your administration, which may include, your school principal, the front office, plan operations, that's going to include, your maintenance, any kind of utilities, food service operations, and then transportation. So they've combined the top three functions to call the classroom spending. So in fiscal year 23, we estimate that to be about 72.2, very similar to the previous year that is reported of 72.7, and the non-classroom spending 27.8 compared to this 27.3. So very similar, very comparable to our previous fiscal year. We then get compared to what are called peer districts. So the Auditor General then says, okay, Dysart, you are this makeup, this size, this region. Your peer districts are these other districts that are also very makeup and similar size and structure. And so compared to those districts, you'll see where they are right above or right below us at 72.5, 27.5, but we are above the state average in classroom spending. So the classroom spending for the state across the board in 22 was 69.6, and the non-classroom was 30.43. So this does help to put into context. In the previous slides, we looked at just M&O, which is one fund. Then we looked at just the various capital funds. This one combines all of the various funds as a school district that we have. They compile all of our general ledger and financial information, and they provide this report. And so this is also available on the Arizona Auditor General. It is posted on our website as well, the district spending report from fiscal year 22, since that's the one that we have most available. So you're more than welcome to pull that up on our budget website. Question?
Will that also list the peer districts that were the actual district names?
Yes. Yes, so the question is, will that link also include the peer districts? It does. When you go onto that link, it takes you to the Auditor General's website, and it's a very live, like you can kind of adjust it, filter out for what you want to see. They used to send it to us in a PDF, and it was a very static file. But in the last probably about 3 years, they've made it a very live, interactive, so you can adjust and kind of filter for who you want to look at. But yes, I would definitely recommend for you to look at other districts. Okay, so on the next slide, please. So just want to provide, again, we've gone from this high level. We're trying to kind of now talk about, as it relates to Dysart, where do we spend our money? Where's the majority of our funds spent? Obviously, M&O is the largest expense that we have. That's just our regular personnel. And then we've determined that we spend a certain amount on capital. This next slide is, I thought was helpful to understand the history of where we've been as a school district and what we received. As I mentioned earlier, that district additional assistance is the state-funded capital amount that we receive. And so if you recall, when we were going through the recession in 2007, 2008, the state started to have to reduce the amount that was appropriated for school districts or was allocated. We then started seeing budget reductions and budget adjustments. And so the reason I say that is because you can see, and it started earlier than 2014, but I just wanted to kind of focus in on this decade or so, is really as a district since 2014, our district additional assistance, the true budget amount that we would have been allocated is $134.68 million. The amount that we were ultimately funded was the $74 million. So over the course of those years, and you'll see the tough years were there in 2016 through 18, when we were really only funded for $1.5 million when we should have received about $11.5 to $12 million. So over those years, we had a $60.6 million reduction in state capital. So we think about what could have been done with $16 million additional over the course of those 10 years. Obviously, there's some needs that we've talked about that I think could have been addressed. I think over those few years, there was a deficit. A school district of this size with $1.5 million of capital, there's a lot of needs that happen. We have, instructional software that's considered, those licenses for software, that's considered to be capital by the state. So, devices, down to a transportation bus engine. So there's a lot of needs that have to be met. Obviously, those fiscal years of 2016 to 18 were some very challenging ones, with only having about $1.5 million that you can work with. So it does help to provide a little bit of context on kind of where, and this is just Dysart across the state. We are seeing this with a lot of other districts that went through this. Yes, Patrick.
So to be clear, the first column, the DAA, that's what the state promised you?
Correct. So the
funded DAA is what they actually gave you?
That's correct. So the question.
How far into the fiscal year do you realize, hey, we're going to be, ultimately $60 million short?
So the question is, does the DAA represent what the state would have provided to us? And the question is yes. So basically, when we're developing our state budget or the school budget for the next fiscal year, we have enrollment reports, and so then we put in there, okay, this is how many kids I have in K-8 and 9-12, preschool, et cetera. There is then a per pupil funded amount that we receive by the state related to district additional assistance or capital. That amount is already developed at the time we propose our budget and ultimately adopt it. So we know, and so the state had already provided us at that time saying, hey, we think there's going to, on those years there was about 80-90% budget reductions, they were already telling us the initial budget worksheets that you guys are developing, you're going to see about an 80% reduction. And so we already went into the fiscal year knowing that it was going to be a significant cut, which is what the funded DAA, your question is, what does the funded DAA column represent? That is ultimately what we received in funding by the state to support our capital needs. Some districts, what they did then is, seeing that was a need, you then say, okay, do I now take some of my M&O allocation and move it over into capital? You saw some districts possibly having to do that. So that's why you'll see, if we did that in some year, there may have been a year where we can't give the salary increase, turns out, because we have to support some capital needs, which is why our budget amount might be a little bit of a different figure than what that district additional assistance amount is. Often people get confused and they see that DAA and they assume that that's our budget, but not necessarily. That's saying that's what the revenue would have been. And ultimately, we may have supplemented in a different way by moving maybe M&O and transferring it on our budget, and then I get too far down the rabbit hole with that. So, Yes.
Like the time. Do you have a year's notice for that, or do you have 2 months notice? Like, how much notice are you getting that, hey, by the way, you're going to have 80% reduction?
So the question is, how often in advance did we start receiving this notice? We were receiving the notice, I would say, probably springtime of the year that you're developing the budget for the next fiscal year. That's when the state adopts their budget, well, really like in January, February, once the state starts adopting their budget, that's when we had a general idea of, as education, what are the cuts going to be. We receive a lot of advance notice by the Joint Legislative Budget Committee, who then says, these are the anticipated cuts for this coming year. The Arizona Department of Education also did a great job of giving us that advance notice of, this is coming, this is upcoming. And as school districts, we knew this was happening. That was the state of, the climate in Arizona. There was the recession. We were trying to get out of it. And so ultimately, the impact is still there, though. And you may have heard there is a state capital funding lawsuit right now that is specifically related to this, that there's some school districts that went into litigation against the state because of the fact that across the board, the funding wasn't there for well over a decade.
And we're not one of those.
We are not one of the litigants. Yeah, we're not in that litigation, no. But they are representing, I think Glendale Elementary, a few other school districts are in that. But ultimately, this is something that was felt across the state. So that's just, it's good to kind of have that context of seeing, how we kind of got to that stage. I'm sorry, is there a question? Yes, sir.
Early 2000s, the voters approved a bond issue for Dysart. And most of that, probably all of it, has now been spent. Would the previous slide that showed the capital budget, would that have included the bond money from back in those days? Had money been left over or still accounted for?
So the question is, when the bond was approved back in 2006, that was the last time that the bond was approved. Were there any funds left over? And if they were, are they included in that $18 million of last year's budget? Is that the question? That is correct. So we do have to keep separate funds. So again, kind of referring back to the USFR chart of accounts, we have different funds that we have to kind of buckets of money that the funds that come in and funnel in, they have to be spent according to that. So for example, that what's called bond building fund, it was Fund 630. When we received those funds and the bonds were sold and the funds come in, those projects ultimately were paid out of there entirely, and that fund has since been depleted. That fund has been inactive on our general ledger since I started here in 2013, so I have not seen an active bond building fund in 10 years. So I think in about 2010, 11 is probably the last year we saw activity in that fund. So anything that's left in our capital is truly the funding that we've been getting through the state.
So the debt service is accounted for?
The debt service fund acts as the capacity to pay off the debt that was incurred through that bond payment or through the bonds that were approved.
So if the voters approved a new bond coming up, fast forward 3 or 4 years from now, and we were sitting here, we'd see a separate spreadsheet of bond projects that were currently being expended.
That is correct. So the question is, if in the future voters approved a bond, would we now be seeing that bond activity separately on the spreadsheets? And that's correct. So let's say the voters approved a bond, the funds come in, their bonds are sold, and the funds come in. We then are also annually required by statute to provide our governing board an update on how those bonds are being spent. And so there is a separate, you would see, let's say there was $50 million, or whatever, I'm just throwing out a number. You would then see that activity, hey, here's our budget, this is how much we've spent against it, this is how much is left over. And we also have to track it by, if the bonds are sold in different series, we have to track them by different projects. There's a far more tracking that has to happen when there are active bond building funds available. Really what that debt service now is let's say you just went out and refinanced your home and the money came in and you spent it on your projects, that was essentially your bond building fund, right? Now you have this amortization or this mortgage payment you have to now pay over the next 15, 20 years. That's essentially what the debt service fund is doing. It's now just paying off the debt for bonds that you already spent on. Hope that clarifies it a little bit.
Oh, that'll be a question.
Yes, yes. One other question. So the question is that bond paid off now? That bond, if you recall from our last meeting, it was slated to be paid off in fiscal year 28. So we have 69, at the end of this fiscal year, we'll have $69 million left in outstanding principal related to that bond. So in 5 years, we could, we would have essentially no bonds outstanding as a district, or no outstanding payments related to previously approved bonds. So if a bond is recommended, does this payment go on top of that? It would. It would. So essentially so we see on the tax breakdown, the tax rate, as the bonds start getting, or the debt starts getting paid off, you start seeing that rate start getting less and less and less. Essentially, this would now layer on top of that, and now it would continue your next amortization period of paying those off over the next however many years. So 69, depends on when it would be approved. But yes, so right now we have $69 million outstanding debt. Essentially, you're asking, could we then go out and purchase now new bonds or have new bonds issued and authorized, and now that payment would now be layered on top of that outstanding debt? That is correct. Yes.
So the taxpayers right now are paying an extra percentage on their taxes to pay for this current bond. If we approve a second bond, we now are adding even more taxes they have to pay. But in 5 years, what happens? The first bond's gone, so taxes go back down?
So the question is, essentially right now, taxpayers are currently paying a bond, and then if one was to get approved, would that now add more taxes to that? So the question is, yes. So let's say we now have this tax rate that is getting paid off, and as the bonds fall off, usually as I'm looking at a payment schedule, it starts getting smaller and smaller. And so yes, the tax rate associated with that starts reducing. And let's say a bond is approved, it now does layer next to it. And yes, as these fall off, that bond schedule now continues for the next however many years.
Not necessarily a tax increase, but it replaces the existing bonds that were in place that had been paid off.
It would be, so the question is, it's not necessarily a tax increase, but it replaces the bonds that are paid off. I think that's also semantics, because it could be considered, well, I wouldn't have had that tax increase if the bonds weren't approved. So is the intent that usually school districts structure it such that the bond that the taxpayers feel, the tax rate that the taxpayers feel is smoothed out? Usually you work with your underwriter to make sure that the taxpayers also aren't seeing this to their tax rates. If the taxes are starting to go down, they usually have payments that start kind of getting layered on, and so it smooths out, and then these will start falling off, and then these continued. So usually what you see is if bonds are approved, they layer next to it, but they're kept at a rate. The payment schedule is done at a rate so that it continues at a smoothed rate of what the rate is that they usually are used to paying. That is correct. It's based on their assessed valuation. So the question is, last committee meeting, we reviewed peer group districts, and those peer groups are also the same ones that we refer to in the classroom spending report of our peer groups, and that they had significantly more outstanding bonds. Yes, that's correct. So at that time we reviewed, and if you have your presentations with you from last time, but we reviewed, we were one of the lowest ones on there. The highest one on there was Chandler at the time, was a little over 350, and then the next lowest, and then we're the lowest Dysart, and then the next one after us was Deer Valley. So I'm just kind of looking at it briefly at this presentation, but yes. Since then, obviously, there's been elections that have passed last week or have concluded, and so there's been passes and fails, and so the numbers obviously have changed, and some districts have now had additional bonds authorized and approved, and others have not. So. But yes, when you look at the information we reviewed last year, at the last meeting, and that information source of the data was the previous fiscal years, all of their annual comprehensive financial reports, and so we were one of the lowest, the lowest. You're welcome. Yes. No, you're fine. So the question is, now with additional building and the commercial and all of the additional just new homes that are going in, does that get accounted in it? It does, because ultimately now you have more of a property base and a more of a valuation that you have, that you're assessing. The pot that you're assessing this tax on is greater, so that each individual doesn't absorb as much of it as you otherwise would. It's spread among a larger tax base, essentially. Is that the question? Okay. All right. Yes.
Does anyone know offhand what that tax rate is?
Does anyone know what the current tax rate on what? I'm sorry? I do. I can look it up in a little bit and I will report back. Yes. No, but great questions. The question was, what is the current tax rate on our current bonds? And I do have that, but I want to give you the accurate number, so just a second, I'll refer back. All right. Yes.
On that slide, see the 2024 fiscal year 2024, you were saying per pupil and the estimates of how many kids that are enrolled and stuff. Is that all including these new builds that are coming in? The possibility of new students enrolling in 2024?
So that figure, the question is, does the 2024 figure include any builds or any new students coming in? No. So our district additional assistance is based off of our actual current student enrollment that we have in our schools at the moment. So we receive monthly reports by the state. Every day we're uploading student enrollment data. And so when we so this 13 million right now is based off of what we adopted our budget off of. We will be planning to revise our budget. We revised it a couple times during the school year based off now known student enrollment counts. So that 13,058,000 may go up or down depending on ultimately what our student enrollment now is in November, December, based on what we thought it was going to be in June, July when we adopted the budget. But this is based off student enrollment, the district additional assistance. It's student enrollment times a certain percentage that the state funds it. It's a weighted amount. This is independent of property valuations or anything. This is just student count times a certain amount that we receive from the state equals how much you get in funding for capital from the state.
You talked about surrounding districts. Within Dysart and Surprise, there's maybe than other districts. They operate in capacity. What rules do they have to follow?
So the question is, Dysart has a large number of charter schools surrounding us in comparison to our other peer districts. And what are the rules over overrides and bonds for them? Charters are not, they don't use that mechanism of funding. They don't have overrides, and they also don't go out for bonds. So that is something specifically that school districts.
So they don't have access to any of those additional funds when they need bonds?
They don't follow the same process in funding as school districts. So no, they don't go out for overrides. They receive charter additional assistance, and they receive other items that they're very similar in the amount of funding per pupil. Their charter additional assistance is funded for inflation. School districts isn't necessarily. They're a little bit different in the way they're funded, even though the funding does come from the state entirely. Do you have a comment?
I don't know if this is correct or not, but my understanding is there's different types of charters, and one particular type of charter, the employees are semi-public employees where they're part of ASRS.
I don't know. I wouldn't know the detail. I don't want to comment on something that's something I wouldn't know. But the question is, some charter schools, the employees are not part of ASRS. So it could be that if they don't contribute to the state retirement system. In years past, I do recall. Go ahead.
No, absolutely. That is correct. There are differences in charters. We can get that information to give some examples of that. But there are charters that you do pay into. They're called a public charter versus a private charter. And a private charter does have different funding sources that usually comes from private companies, where a public charter is more part of the public system.
Some of them have both ways.
Some of them have both, and that's correct, and we can bring that information in as well to show the difference.
Okay, lots of great questions. Hopefully it's it's answering some of them. But great questions, and if there's anything more further, we can certainly look into some of that. I know for now, I think we'll get a little bit more information on the charter question, and then the FY24 tax rate, I believe, is what I'm capturing so far as outstanding. Okay, so kind of further along, so we talked a little bit last time of general bonds, and so as we look as a district, what are the areas, potential areas of need? And so we've identified certain ones, but obviously we want to have a conversation as a group and as a committee, and ultimately you kind of guide those conversations. So these are just some of those areas, so we'll go into the next slide on the breakdown of them. So the transportation, last time I briefly spoke about the need on replacement buses. So currently we have about 134 buses in inventory. 74 of them were 2008 or earlier. So essentially we have more than half of our fleet is about 15 years or older. So the desired age of the fleet would be ideally nothing older than 15 years. So, I mean, we would have to be looking at replacement of all those 74. We're not going into dollars quite yet because we want to be able to start assigning some figures to these items that as a committee we determine you determine are those areas that we want to look further into. But we're just kind of putting out some examples that we can certainly explore cost options and things like that on. Yes. Does that include the white buses? It does not include the white buses. This is just our yellow buses. This is our SPED buses and regular ed buses. Yes. Next slide, please. So other areas, and again, we can break this down and as we start exploring if there's other areas you want to look further into, but these are just other needs across the district. Obviously, when we look at just kind of, you start comparing it to your own home and what types of things and upgrades you would start needing and or replacing over the last 15 plus years that our buildings are, 15 to 20 years old. These are some of the main areas. So asphalt, HVACs. Some of these items, if the projects that we applied for were eligible for that grant renewal funding through the school facilities board, we have had some replacements. You're seeing next door at Valley Vista, that funding for that roofing project that you're seeing is entirely funded through the school facilities board. So there are some projects if the school site is eligible for it. And again, there's other complexity and rules. If you were funded through a bond, you may not be eligible through school facilities board. There's a lot of complexities I don't necessarily want to get into on why we couldn't just go to the school facilities board for all of our projects. That would be ideal. But obviously there's limited funding for them as an agency and also just limited allowability for what would even be eligible for that grant. So these are just some areas that we can certainly explore and talk further on. This next item is safety and security. I know when we talked on our parent advisory council and just a lot of the feedback we hear from the community and from our parents, safety is continuing to be number one up on the list of things that we need to look into. Technology has greatly advanced since the last time we issued that bond, and so these things didn't exist, back in 2006, 2008 when those funds were available. And so here's just a list of some of those areas that have been just kind of brainstormed on. These are some areas that we've identified as the need, but obviously we can discuss more of those in detail and also start assigning some dollar values to some of these items.
And just to add to that a little bit, this list is obviously a brainstormed list, so there might be other aspects that somebody would bring to our attention or say that, but these were the most critical items that were identified. A lot of that, what you're going to see on here, you might prioritize in different nature of one versus the other, but obviously the elements as you look at those, and you guys have, when you're on one of our campuses, you'll notice some of the intentional purpose of how we've created single points of entry and doing some of those elements. We have experience of people in the room that can talk to you a little bit more about safety and security that work it every day, whether administrators or employees. So we don't have to go into it specifically now, but we did want to make sure that you saw some of those elements of how many areas are making to ensure safety for schools, and that's why they're identified here. So that's another item for discussion. Obviously, we wanted to bring to your attention, and we could get into more of that minutia later on other items, but as this item as well.
Thank you, Craig. And then the other item, or the other kind of area priority, is addressing the student growth. So I know we spoke a little bit about that last time. In future committee meetings, we definitely want to bring in our planner demographer just to kind of start providing more information on what is that projected growth in that northwest area. But in the meantime, these are just some of those two main areas of priorities that we can certainly dive further into. So tonight we wanted to really get your input and allow you as a committee to really have that conversation and have that brainstorming as well. So we have the chart paper there. We have a couple Sharpies. We certainly have a lot more available here if you needed some. But just to discuss as a group, any other potential needs that either you're aware of, you've heard of, you know, just other things that, again, you are the eyes and ears. You're out there. You hear, you see our sites. You know what's out there as well. And so just as a group, have that conversation, I would say, the next few minutes. And then we can regroup together and kind of categorize those areas. Thoughts, Craig?
Yeah, just a couple of things as you get started on that. So we're gonna check in with you in about 5 minutes. So it's gonna feel like C-SPAN in here for a little bit as we let you guys brainstorm at tables. Keep in mind, we're only on the bond discussion. We've still got another element we're gonna talk about override. I mean, so that's we know that it's about providing you guys all that information, but we did want to take an opportunity at this time for you guys to voice any of your opinions related to areas of need within a bond, and you can any other comments you want to make towards that element of, you know, that what we've presented as well. And we're going to ask tables to go ahead and share that information. So we're going to go about 5 minutes, and then we'll do a report out from each table. I know we're kind of if you two wouldn't mind joining the table back there with those three, and then what we'll do is we'll check in at about 5, see where everybody's at. Please, snacks and water if you need it, or a drink, and then we'll take an opportunity to report out on some of your brainstorm thoughts on just bond, which is obviously you can see is related to, and I want to emphasize this so you'll notice that was all related to the areas of capital. So if you're starting, you start to put down things right now, we're not really. You could say it, and it's not going to be a problem. But if you start talking about like, hey, salary or pay or something like that, you could say it, and you can say that's an element that's important at your table discussion. We understand that, but that we would just note that that's not really, you know, in the end, that's not something a bond would encompass, and we would have to talk about that in another capacity. So there's no wrong answers is what I'm trying to say. Okay? Thank you.
I do have one question.
Yes, question.
As far as capital expenditures, like you mentioned, Valley Vista's getting a roof.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume there's a lifespan on that, 15 years, 20 years, whatever that's projected. Do we budget on a yearly basis? Like it's, I don't know, we'll throw out $1 million that it costs to do that roof. So over 20 years, $500,000 a year. Do we put that away in a fund for that stuff? Or do we just wait, okay, 20 years, we need $1 million for a roof?
So the question is, like, for when there's a large improvement that's needed, for example, like the roof project next door, how do we fund for that? So yes, we work with our facilities team who has a multi-year capital plan, and so he has included, hey, we're going to have these flooring needs at these sites. These sites are up for asphalt and repairing of the concrete. The roofing is going to start being needed for this. And so we do we budget for that within every fiscal year as long as there's funding capacity available. But those large projects, when it's going to be, let's say, I mean, the roofs now run 5-10 million, like they're a lot. So if you're funded as a district, let's say 13 million a year, that's going to get eaten up in one roof. So yeah, it definitely, we allocate and we budget to meet all of the upgrades or the renovations that are needed, but not necessarily full replacements.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, whatever you budgeted for the last 3 years, it was going to jump by 30% regardless.
Right, and inflation.
And I would just add to your question about budgeting, or almost like I think of like a rainy day fund.
Mm-hmm.
That element, when you're talking about, you know, the district is, as you look at, you know, the area of the number of schools, you're talking, you've got, you know, and 28 different buildings, 25 different school sites. So, and many of them built where they were coming in one year after another. So you talk about HVAC, you know, we talk about those chillers and stuff like that, the amount of money you're talking about as well. That's why the state does have a school facility board, and there's a capital funding source, and that's when Mary Dale was talking about how much money is expected and then what did not come in as well. It's because it would be no different. So you're correct in that aspect of the attempts, but it's done as more of to ensure that we're maintaining operation.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right, so we'll let the group work, and then we'll check in a few minutes.
If I could get your attention just for a second. When you're completed at your tables with your discussion, if you wouldn't mind, somebody, or you can have us come get it. We want to put your chart up here on the easel so other people can see it in the room. When you're done, that way we know your table's done, and then we'll just wait patiently for the other tables to finish. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna get started again, and everybody brought their charts up front, so we're gonna go around to each table. I will allow. I know you guys will be fine. Handing off who wants to speak. If you could talk about what's on your list, and then if anybody else at the table wants to say anything, absolutely. Just pass the mic. And then if anybody else out there wants to ask a question related to something that's on their list, we'll be ready to do that with another mic in the room as well. So, all right, we're going to start here.
I'm going. All right. So for our table, we're this furthest one over here, that's titled Capital Needs. We definitely have a need to add preschool safe playgrounds. Some of our schools were built 20 years ago, and we didn't have preschools at that time. And so currently, our preschool, our kindergarten level playgrounds are not safe for 2 and 3 year olds. And some of them are so old that it isn't, when you call a rep to come retrofit it to make it safe, it's too old to be retrofitted, so it needs to be completely replaced. Then we do have some 20-year-old plus playgrounds out there that are rusty and old and are causing some hazards to our kids, so we want to replace those. Also adding shade structures. All of our playgrounds currently have a shade structure, but we would need to add additional ones if we were able to add preschool playgrounds. Additionally, in the front of the building, oftentimes at dismissal, we're at 118 degrees, and our kids are waiting to be picked up, and it is hot, and it takes sometimes 20 to 30 minutes. So to add those added shade structures in the front of our buildings would be so helpful. And then also, we know technology is outdated the month after it comes out. So continuing to replace or update that. Adding a security door buzzer to the exterior of the front of the building with a camera, so front office staff can choose to open the buzzer of that front exterior door and allow people into that office. And then updating classrooms, furniture, fixtures and equipment. We know a lot of our classrooms have 20-year-old furniture in there, and we deserve to give our kids warm, cozy environments with modern new furniture that they feel excited to come to school and learn in. So,
Are there any questions for
Yes. So, yeah. So, yeah.
The elementary schools have preschools on them is the question, and it's not quite all of.
All right. Well, is this on? Oh. Oh, there we go. We're volunteering Mr. Campbell here.
So, is it on? Negative? Yes? Okay, cool. So first, just general discussion first before we started writing. Security came up, and I just noticed a little bit of a theme coming across here. Obviously, my background being law enforcement, military, and then retired, was a tactical instructor. Also worked security at Shadow Ridge. So, I mean, it's kind of something that I do, right? But we talked with this. Jason, who's one of our, I don't know what his title is now, safety director of safety, and then the new person we've got, his name is Kevin Sarter. He's actually the safety coordinator, if you will. There's the two. So just a little input on that. We did have our first security training / meeting for the first time, because I had, the whole time I worked for the district, I've never had any kind of training or anything when it comes to that. Formally, where we get together and we have a discussion, actual hands-on training, that kind of stuff. So we just started that. So the last Monday of each month, we'll be having that. We're rotating high schools, but that's only the high school, so that's 4, right? So Jason and Kevin, one of the things we'd like to do is have a group go actually sit down and meet with them. I've actually already kind of prepped this discussion by kind of letting them know, hey, by the way, this is going to happen, because I'd like to get their input, things that they're already doing versus wish list, want list, what's happening, what's not happening, stuff like that. So we'd get feedback for the committee here. And then that's going to be an ongoing thing. The commitment to quality, and this is something that Meg very specifically brought up, and I 100% agree with this. We don't want to see Band-Aids on hemorrhages. So if you've got a problem, we don't want to, don't give me a 5-cent fix for if we could just get it replaced with a better, higher quality item, if that makes sense. Or new item, yeah. In other words, we're not just continually, kicking the can down the road, if you will. So that was something, and I agree to that. And then the transportation cost per mile. So the thought was maybe sit down with Karma and/or Doug or whoever over at that. We want to get the evaluation, cost per mile evaluation, which I'm hearing. You want to speak to this?
The reason why I put this up here, in my circle, my community, everybody's telling me school buses. We need school buses. That's what people are telling me. I don't know if it's true. I have no idea. But that's what I'm hearing a lot. In 2022, I don't know what it is now, but Dysart's dollar per mile was one of the highest in the state. So I don't know if that's true now. That's why we keep asking about transportation. So that's Auditor General. So if that's true, we need to talk about that. If we're going to buy new school buses, how are we dealing with the cost per mile in this district? That's why I just wanted to bring it up. People, something we have to deal with. That's all. So.
I want to make sure that we hear that question. So you want to repeat that, please? What changed in 2022?
That's a great question to admin. My guess is geography has a role in it. You're probably right. We just need to understand that as a group. So
So the question is what caused the price to go up in 2022, and was there things that were either outside factors versus things the district may have implemented and done? And I think that's the answer we want to bring to the table. table. I know that some suggestions were just mentioned. Did it have outside factors of whether it be gas prices, right, that had impact?
Yeah.
Or was it also the impact of anything that the district did? It was mentioned whether it be the implementation of middle schools in the district. We did know mentioned we heard mentioned earlier that the hourly rate for bus drivers. There was an increase. There is a high demand. I don't know if it's just in Arizona or in the Valley, but I can tell you that the high demand is out there for finding people to drive buses. Yeah. So I think that was a really good point to bring up, and that's a question we need answered in this room.
And maybe if we bought new buses, maybe the age of the buses are playing a role in that too. I have no idea. But maybe when if we buy new buses, that might reconcile some of these, might generate savings. I don't know, but it's something we should think about. So could be.
I think those are all fair points. It's something we can bring here to study. I will tell you that there are elements related to that when you talk about the types of buses and the types of fuel and the way that you know whatever energy you're using to drive that bus. And there are things that could be looked at and suggested by the committee in that.
Shannon has a question up front.
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was just kind of a concern. Not really a concern, but I just want to bring to the attention. I don't know if it's something that we'll talk about now or at future meetings, but I do want to bring to the forefront support for ELs. I feel like I would be remiss as a targeted English teacher. And if you're not familiar with what ELs are, they're English language learners. They're here learning the English language. I feel like we need more support and more information and training around that particular subgroup. So even if it's not something that we discuss now at this time, I just want to make sure that we have that at the forefront of our mind at some point.
Thank you.
Other questions from the group?
Patrick, well, we'll give you the mic since it's a little bit longer. Yeah.
So I know we have, correct me if I'm wrong, Craig. So I know we have 13 SROs total. That comes from Surprise PD. We at just where I'm at, there's 6 of us. Now, one of those drives what we call the West Mech bus. So basically, he's never on campus. So in essence, there's 5 of us that cover the entire campus. I'm sure that the other high schools are similar in staffing sizes, 4 or 5, somewhere around there, give or take. Okay, so that's where we're at right now. Yeah.
Thank you. And both of those resources that we now have, both the school resource officer or the school safety officer, fortunately, we did receive grants from the state of Arizona. That is what's funding those additional resources for safety. So those are, again, personnel costs that otherwise we would have to find in the budget, but we did obtain those grants.
you.
I know there's solar on Liskin. I'm gonna let Marydale answer that one.
Yeah.
I know there's-
Yeah, it was a few years ago. We actually installed solar at all of our, pretty much all of our sites. In fact, we meet monthly with the company that assesses that. Like, they review it on the daily. We have the ability to see, is there a grid that's down? Is there something going up? And so we've actually, our footprint on solar in this district is one of the highest in the entire state of Arizona, to the level that we are looking for ways to reduce our utility cost. And we have seen an improvement with that, and also just general energy management systems. So yes, definitely solar has made its mark in Dysart. Yes.
Does the power companies that you have these agreements with, do they limit the amount of percentage that you're allowed to have?
That we're allowed to buy back. Yeah, I'd have to get into the details, but how much we can buy, and ultimately then there's some days where we see the fluctuations, and then there's some of it's, I mean, this past year with the summer, it was a really tough one regardless. Even I can't imagine without solar what our bills would have been. But yes, there's definitely some agreement language on how much, what that is, but the specifics I couldn't state right now, but yes.
And the solar company, which is Verigy, provided
Mhm.
mid-state energy.
Correct.
They guarantee the savings under performance contracts.
Yes, there's performance contracts. Mhm. Correct. So we utilize Verigy. Thank you for that information. Yes, they have to honor that commitment on that agreement, and really that guarantee that they are going to save us a certain amount of funding, and so they're held to that in those agreements. Yep.
Couple of comments.
Your question regarding the crosswalks, your accountant.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be something that the city's going to have to do.
Repeat that.
The comment. There is a schedule to replacing all of those uniforms, and you know, for example, football just ended, and they're a little bit more cumbersome than others at the high school level. Helmets, you have to buy a certain number of new helmets every year, and there is budgeting that's provided for that we have to do to make sure that happens.
And that's even through the
It falls down into the K-8 level as well.
Yes.
It's on a 3-year rotation for all sports. The K-8 level obviously is and they're not. We do it, and I don't want to. I'm not going to speak entirely for everything that happens. I know that typically for any high school sport, as well as the K-8, we're always looking at when you rotate those, you're buying out of a 3-year cycle, and then they rotate down to JV and freshman. Is the idea of uniforms over time, but at the K-8 level, it happens as well. Yes. All right, we're going to move on to the next portion of this so that we can get some explanation on the override piece, and I'm going to pass it back over to Marydale.
All right, thank you. Yeah, lots of great discussion. That's why I looked at the time, I'm like, oh, wow, I did not budget enough time for that. So just now to briefly, and actually in some of these conversations, some of these additional supports that you looked at as areas of priority are those types of things. They're personnel, they're programs. You mentioned parapros and SPED. Like, those are the type of more personnel-related items that could be considered more on an override versus, as we talked about, more capital bond-type items. So I wanted to briefly go over this. This, again, was information that was brought to the board at our October board meeting. Again, we're statutorily required, if we have a current override in place, districts are required to take that, an update to the board of what is the override currently in place for, what programs are funded through it, and then ultimately how that breakdown and spending went into those individual areas. So this is a little bit less information as the bond is, but we wanted to still continue to provide that opportunity as a group, now kind of have discussions on the override piece. So just briefly going through the programs that are funded, and this, again, was information that was approved through the previous override language. So allowing us to maintain the current class sizes, again, is just really ensuring we have those teachers. It funds approximately 130 teachers that would maintain the current class sizes. So obviously, without those that override in place, the class sizes would go up. Keeping teacher salaries competitive. So again, we'll look at the next slide. Actually, I'll speak to these bullets really quick, and then I'll go to the number side. Keeping extra math and reading supports in place, maintaining arts, PE, athletics, and then allowing Dysart to continue to offer all-day kindergarten. So I've included the link on here if you wanted more specific information on all that. It breaks it down into the different categories that you're welcome to review in further detail. So on the next slide, it actually breaks down how we spent the funds in 22-23. We spoke, I think on the previous presentation, fiscal year 23-24's override is currently $24.5 million in the budget. And again, this is all based on your student enrollment, and so that's going to drive what the amount of the override is. So in 22-23, these were the areas that were funded through the override. And so we had about $2.5 million, which was provided for the compensation for teachers, class size reduction, again, knowing that we often have a lot of conversations on class sizes, and so really when we look at what would removing about $10 million in support, we know that that would have a direct impact to both regular education class sizes as well as special education class sizes. So just conversations on that. Reading and math, really that funds our reading and math supports, our interventionists, we have curriculum specialists, we also, our programs, our music programs, art programs, band programs, et cetera, athletic programs, and then return to full day kindergarten. And we say return because this override that was approved is continuing the full day. When the override, if you recall, I don't know if anyone was here in 2014, 2015? I'm forgetting now. The years have officially blurred together, but when the override did not pass in that time, and we did start the year one of the phase out. So we essentially took our override and we did have to reduce it by a third. So at that time, if you recall, we did have the reduction in force of about 140 teachers. We saw our band, our music programs, art programs, those teachers then started having to really start going from 2 sites up to 4 sites. It started that cut you felt. The full day K, we went to half day kindergarten. So if you, I don't think I mentioned it last time, but the state just funds half day kindergarten. So that's why you'll see other either districts or other school systems, they either offer just half day kindergarten, or if you're going to be funding full day, how are you going to support it? And so at our district, it's funded through this voter approved initiative. So that's the breakdown in that piece of it. So over the last few overrides that I recall, these have been the prime areas of focus. And so since then, though, are there specific other additional needs? Do we focus on something else rather than in these areas? So knowing that the override goes to support specific needs that we've identified as a community, we wanted to kind of provide that same opportunity right now, if you go to the next slide, really to, again, talk at your groups on what do you see? Let's say we were continuing on an override, and that's the decision that the committee recommends. Would we stay with those similar areas of support? Is there a new area of support? Because I know other districts, they may fund a little bit differently. But again, this all has to stay in the programs and personnel piece of it. Again, this doesn't fund capital. This would really be programs and support. And questions? Yes. The question, where do school nurses fall in? They are funded through our maintenance and operations. So We have what I call health service assistants at all of our sites, and then we have a lead nurse at our district. So where there isn't necessarily a registered nurse at every school site, but we do have a health service assistant at our sites, not all of our sites, yes. So that need is met. Question, yes.
Where do the EL teachers find? Is that highly qualified teachers, or is it part of the national legal?
So the ELL teachers, again, we do receive a little bit of additional support through the state for ELL funding. So that falls within our general maintenance and operations. So that's not necessarily an additional piece above in the override. We do receive additional support from the state on ELL funding. You're welcome. Oh, sorry, there was a question. That's okay. So the question, what makes up the class size reduction? So really the amount that we're looking at is approximately, like I said last time, when we had to start cutting the pieces on the initial gradual decrease of the override and the phasing out of it. Really the class size reduction is accounting for the amount of teachers that we're really able to employ with the use of this override. So basically, when we say class size reduction, if the override was not in place, class sizes are going to be higher. So the override is helping to support a class size reduction. Often people say, well, our class sizes are high. Well, that's currently the state now. So if we took out 24 million plus, it will definitely have an impact. No, the class size reduction is your student to teacher ratio. So your class size ratios. Correct. So same with the process that we had to go at the time. We did go through a reduction in force, and so then those class sizes saw a related increase.
In 2014, when the override failed, you laid off 146 teachers.
Correct.
2015, when the override passed, you hired them back.
That's correct. So in 2014, when the override failed, we did have to RIF over the 140. And then in 2015, we went back out again to the voters, and then it did pass, and then we had to reinstitute all those programs. Half day K went back to full day K, and so it's just, you make a 1 year change, and then you have to kind of pivot and now restore as much as you can.
Is any of the M&O override money used towards teacher pay increase?
Yes, so
What would happen if that failed?
same. So again, we look at about $2.5 million as provided for compensation. So if we don't have that additional funding source, then we're just going back to kind of that bare bones of what we get from the state as a whole.
About 10%?
Of what 10% is related to it? Yes, sorry, yep, about 10% of that. Yep. So we would have to really have a very minimal increase that granted, you'd now have less teachers to have it across because we'd have to, that would impact about $10 million worth on this current override that we have in place. Yes.
So if you have an override that you're facing 140 teachers on, that doesn't swing over to a budget of those 140 teachers and take them off of that override? They always have to be funded by an override, so you would always need to continue an override when you cut your teachers by that many?
So the question is, right now, when we say we have certain amount of teachers or certain positions that are funded through this override, if the override is not in place, do those positions go away? Yes.
Right, my question is, okay, so you get an override to get those teachers, why wouldn't they swing over to be?
Is there not enough funding to cover them in the regular budget?
Override, guys, it allows them to get
Right.
the budget. That's why I call it override.
Right. So that's in the definition of the override, is you go above what the state funded amount is, which then provides additional, it's basically telling the community, saying, hey, we want these additional, we want full day K, we want, smaller class sizes than what otherwise would be in place. We want to have a band and music teacher, art, athletic at all of our sites. So it is really above and beyond what the state would provide. So without that in place, we would go down to the minimum.
It really becomes the equivalent of 140 plus teachers.
We'd have to look, yeah. Yes, so, and correct. And ultimately, that is the decision that's done by the board, is these are the programs that are in place, and this is ultimately what's funded through the override. How, if we then had to take that $24 million and start, cutting it by a third every year, how that rolls out ultimately would be a board decision. But you do want to look at the programs that the override specifically supports as your first areas to look at, which are those areas that we've stated here. Shannon, do you want, let me get you mic, sorry. Wait. I can rephrase questions. What's
So I was just making a comment regarding the impact of not having full-day kindergarten on instructors is very serious, and it's severe. As an elementary school teacher, we all knew which group of students was not part of full-day kindergarten, and their test scores were significantly lower, and we can fact check, than the students that had full-day kindergarten. So it is important. I know that a lot of times we're talking about the increase in taxes, but it's also our community, our students, and their ability to be successful as they transition, not only in kindergarten, but as they go up. Because as a third grade teacher, we felt the effects of not having full-day kindergarten in 2014.
Great, thank you. There was another.
I'd actually like to follow up with what she was saying. Also, not having full-time kindergarten prevents those mothers the inability to be able to get a full-time job. My daughter was a kindergartner. She went part-time. And so that prevented my wife from being able to go get even at least a part-time job and not possibly a full-time job. So it affects the mothers as well, year in and year out.
All right, great conversations, great comments. So we were going to break into this conversation similar as the bond, but I know we're coming up on our 8 o'clock, and I want everyone to be able to get back home to their families. So in the interest of time, we wanted to just maybe change a little bit. If you want to elaborate on that, Greg.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and because the override may require some more discussion just based on what you guys are pointing out. There's an element to, I think it was brought up over here. Is it Kelly? I think Kelly brought up the questions of how overrides work, and to dive into that a little bit more, I don't think would hurt for some understanding of laying that timeline back out again. So I think I'm feeling like we need to revisit that, because there's an element, and I'm not offering an opinion to this piece. I'm just offering an element of, as you guys ask that question, what you're really getting into is you're talking about how much is the state truly funding education is what you're talking about, and then why would communities pass overrides, asking for, to tax their own community in order to extend to be able to offer full-day kindergarten that's not offered, that's not funded, or things like that. That's what really you're getting into is those questions. And if there's other questions you're asking about our own budget, that's where Mary Dell can bring forward some of those specific numbers, because we want to be very transparent with that. So if you're asking like, okay, so was it funded? Well, here's really what we have. Here's what we're spending. Here's what we're doing. We can go back and revisit those numbers with you. So I feel like revisiting override, the M&O override, could be relevant in our next conversation, in our next meeting. Yes?
Are you under the section of questions?
I think we're at that point. Yes, we're open to the part of questions right now.
My question is, as part of our thought process in terms of bonds, overrides, will we eventually, as we put together a package, look at the demographics of voting in the community and how the votes have gone in the past?
That is a great question. The question was, will we look at the demographics of past elections and how successful bonds and overrides were, have been, and including neighboring districts, and looking at the longevity, but then also the history even here.
I think that's very important that we do, because there's a phenomenon in the community called vote.
Absolutely. Obviously, we've got to think about all our constituents and how the information is brought to all constituents. You guys are a committee that make a recommendation. I want to add on to your point of saying, and and I know if it was Ryan, I'm sorry I didn't repeat that, but it's including all areas, including north of Bell. That we talk about the range of what our community ranges from. I mean, we have from El Mirage to young towns included, Maricopa County. We know that we have schools that are not even they're in Waddell. So, I mean, I know there's a number of communities that surround Surprise that are part of it. And so when we talk about the overall history, I think as well, of understanding the history of bonds and overrides, there's an element, though, I want to make sure I add on to that, is that this committee is going to, and I pointed this out at the last of our, because we're going to move to our next item here in just a minute as we wrap up, and it's titled number 3, information and survey development and future meetings. As we get into to wrapping this up, remember that this committee is going to make a recommendation down the road of, do you recommend that the district pursue a bond? Do you recommend that the district pursue an override? Do you recommend that the district pursue both? Do you recommend that the district does neither? That is still something that's going to come out of this committee, okay? And I think right now we're at the point too is that there's some things I see for our next meeting, and if somebody sees something different, please tell me. But I think we need to finish the conversation on override and make sure we have some clear understanding there. I believe that we want specific information on. Sorry, I got it. You're okay. We need some specific information on the elements of bond when we have the questions related to security, transportation. We want to have specific conversations on those items. And I'm also seeing up there a couple other items related to where we could bring in and have people who work in those departments can provide that information. If you're talking about, we saw up there, new school builds, or related to land and where you build and things like that. Renovations I saw up there as well. So there are some targeted areas that we would want to bring into our discussion in the next meeting, okay? To be able to study those a little bit more. And finally, the bigger one that we had mentioned in the last meeting is we also want to bring information to all of you, and we wanted to use an outside consultant to come speak to the group and get your thoughts on this, of putting a survey out to the community, meaning that we can get information. So you guys would be able to talk with the consultant and see, would we want to put a survey out and let people offer their opinions as to what they think they want to see happen. Finally, I want to say, though, we have 4 spokespeople in here, and I think it was a really good point. We talked to them before this meeting, and they pointed out to us it would be really good as if we were to maybe even provide some suggested questions to all of you, but you could always ask whatever you want, and then giving you the opportunity to go down to your local school and talk to the principal about bond override and areas of need of their campus. And so we're going to talk about that in our next meeting, as well as to providing you that information, and then that way you can go out and do that. Yes. You can always bring up that element, but I'm going to let Mary Dell speak to anything that deals with salaries.
The question is, like, at the conversations with what kind of the needs are out there. Yeah, I mean, that's an appropriate time to also have that conversation, just get honest feedback on areas that would pertain to a bond or a potential override. I think that'd be fine. Yep.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, in your position, 2 questions, 2-part. In your position, what are your thoughts on last week's election? The bonds that overrides that passed, the ones that didn't, and have you talked to any professionally, not personally?
I think that's something we can certainly there's been a lot of conversations on that, but I think that will go right in line with what we're looking at for the next time with our the external. That's what he focuses on, is really just looking at results of elections. What does really that mean? But yes, there was a historic elections out there, and so it was interesting to see. But yes, I think that can definitely be a conversation we have on the next time, really diving further into it. Yep.
So we've already started to shape an agenda for the next meeting, continue discussion and talk about override, explore more specifically, get into some of those specific categories within the bond and with those bond topics with some experts in those areas. Having an outside consultant be able to talk with us about doing a survey to our community, and then the element of that opportunity to go speak with your own school, and then finally the history of that we need to put together is the history of bonds, overrides, demographics to that nature, and the success of those. Okay, so those are the pieces we're looking at for our next meeting. You guys are fantastic. I know, very attentive for these 2 hours. I know we need to get to the last portion, so yes.
The changes.
Oh yes, changes on the calendar.
So one of the items that we had on there was just the upcoming meetings. We did want to point out a couple dates that we were able to pin down a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned that. We didn't miss that. There are some dates that we want to point out to you when we get into January. So our next meeting, let me just do this first. Our next meeting after this one is on the 28th. I know that seems far away, but Thanksgiving's next week, and you guys are going to be everybody's going to be busy with family and obviously personally. But right after that, when we come back, into the school mode on the 27th, we have a meeting on November 28th at 6 o'clock. So we'll get the reminder out to you. All the minutes from this meeting will be coming to you. But then in January, I just want to point out January 20th, which is a Saturday. We have already identified January 20th as a Saturday that we can have a potential opportunity to visit sites, look at our buses, look at some of these things that you guys have pointed out in here, whether it be facilities, the areas of renovation, look at the buildings, the way safety works, all of those aspects of what we're talking about in here. So we do have that date secured, January 20th. And then also we had to move the meeting from January 16th, our meeting here, to January 23rd. Because we don't want that meeting in January to come before we go out to sites. We want it to be after we've looked at stuff out there on a Saturday and then be able to talk about it in the meeting. So we know we're asking a lot of everybody here doing these, and we appreciate your time, but we will set these dates out in the minutes as well. January 23rd is the move from the 16th.
Yes.
We still are firm on December 12th. We understand that we're getting close to holiday season. There's going to be conflict. We are aware that will come up. So.
January 20th.
I would say expect more of a half day. I think that would be asking a bit much to ask people to give up their entire Saturday. So, if you guys say after that we need more time, we would obviously respect that. What the committee recommends, if we needed more time, and to come back out. That's correct, and we'll provide. And our goal is right now, and I don't want to I say in the back of our mind, our goal would be in doing that. Would be to provide, obviously, we might want to even provide the transportation as an option. People want to see it and see what it's like for our kids. But that's something I want the committee to decide in the end, too. We don't want to, obviously, dictate all of that to you. We want to hear what you have to say for that. And the comment was agreeing to experience what the kids experience. And I heard Mr. Campbell has already volunteered to drive the bus. So, all right. All right. With that, and me owing you 9 minutes at some point in the future, and you can hold me accountable for that, I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting. We got a motion to adjourn. A second. All in favor? All right. Thank you very much. Meeting is adjourned.